अस्सलाम वालेकुम नाज़रीन, आप देख रहे हैं नसीम ज़हरा टेट. We are very, very fortunate, we are very, very lucky, and we are most honored this evening to have Miss Maria Angelita Ressa with us. She's the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, and she's co-founder and CEO of Rappler. It's a Philippines online news website. We are very fortunate that at a time when not just in Pakistan and Philippines but world over, the whole issue of journalists, their tasks, their role, and how do you proceed forward and what's the objective is so critical today. So warm welcome, a very warm welcome, Maria, to the show, and a warm welcome to the audience in Pakistan, and we are all honored. I'm sure I can speak on behalf of the journalistic community in Pakistan, and certainly the Pakistanis. People will be very delighted to hear you. So let me just very quickly read the statement that the Norwegian Nobel Committee produced. They said Maria Ressa uses freedom of expression to expose abuse of power, use of violence, and growing authoritarianism in her native country, the Philippines. So, Maria, just in terms of freedom of expression, there's always a debate in terms of journalists' freedom of expression or the freedom to convey facts. Do you see those as a similar thing, or do you see those as a different thing?
So it depends on what you're speaking from. First of all, thank you for having me. It's been many, many years since I've been in Islamabad, but I also see how you have had to deal with the same kind of toxic, hate-filled, conspiracy theory-filled, toxic sludge of our information ecosystem. It is global because it's these American social media platforms that are now the world's largest delivery platform for news. But in terms of freedom of expression, look, the Nobel Committee talked about why they gave this prize to journalists, and I think this is for all journalists around the world. It recognizes a moment in time, and that moment in time, I mean, think about it. The last time a journalist was given this prize was in 1936, 85 years ago, and that journalist languished in a Nazi concentration camp. And then the world went through World War II, and we got through a dire moment. I think the Nobel Committee is saying that this moment globally is as dire as that moment. And I always say that it's like an atom bomb exploded in our information ecosystem, and we didn't even know it. It's a little bit more insidious. This is when she talked about freedom of expression. This is Berit Reiss-Andersen, the chair of the Nobel Committee. She said that freedom of speech, freedom of expression is about being to say what you think, how you feel, without fear of any kind of repression or any kind of backlash, right? And that's exactly what is happening on social media globally. It's what governments around the world, in fact, Oxford University's Computational Propaganda Research Project said this year that cheap armies on social media are rolling back democracies in 81 countries around the world. So I think this is not a free speech issue as much as it is the impact of the game changer, which is technology, and it is global in scope.
Okay, so let's start with first the individual. Let's take it the individual journalist, and then we'll go to social media, etc. So the individual journalist, I mean, I'm sure you have experienced, as we experience here, we're being attacked for what we say, the issues that we raise, and it's as if we are being attacked for saying something that is about how we feel as opposed to what is required by society against the touchstone of what law prevails. How do you deal with that?
So the reason why journalists have come under attack, and I'm going to use a phrase to show you that it is connected to geopolitical power play, right? Whether it is the government of my country or yours or India or the United States, right? I mean, what has happened globally is that the micro-targeting of the social media platforms has been exploited for information operations. So in the attacks against me, for example, we actually had analyzed it in collaborative research with the International Center for Journalists and UNESCO, and showed that in nearly 500,000 social media attacks, 60% were meant to pound me. Well, 60% took my credibility down, right? 60% were meant to tear down my credibility. The other 40% were meant to tear down my spirit. And, you know, that is anything from comparing me to every animal you can think of, to taking my head and putting it on human genitals, pretty much dehumanizing things. I think this is happening to journalists around the world.
Yeah.
And to women, right? In the Philippines, women are attacked at least 10 times more than men.
Yeah. Okay. So, can you say something about responsibility of journalists? I think I would again come back to, you know, in these chaotic times, everything falling apart, what is our responsibility? Then we'll come to social media in detail and the dictatorships that we deal with.
I think that the standards and ethics and the mission of journalism haven't changed. You know, what makes journalists different from content creators is courage, because it's part of our mission to speak truth to power, to ask tough questions, to make power angry, and that isn't our intent. Our intent is to use the power because we are proxies for the people, to demand accountability from those in power. But again, the information ecosystem plus the kind of tactics used by leaders around the world where they refuse to answer the questions, certainly this is what my leader does, and instead attacks the journalists, right? And then signals for everyone else to attack the journalists. Our responsibilities are the same, but now when the algorithms, the algorithms of amplification and distribution actually prioritize the spread of lies laced with anger and hate over the facts, then journalism becomes activism.
Yeah, journalism is indeed activism right now as we deal with it. So you talk about facts, Maria, but I think as you move into the process of getting facts, before you're on the journey and you are inundated with attacks and exactly, I mean, it sounded like you were talking of Pakistan social media, our timelines here, that you're attacked and you're abused and so on and so forth. So, so that task becomes even more difficult. What do you do with that? How do you tackle that ecosystem? The echo chamber there is one that, you know, they put in numbers and the numerical strength there erodes, as you just explained what your own kind of the breakdown was, 60% to attack you. How do you tackle that, and how do you ensure that your viewer and your reader doesn't get taken in by the propaganda against you?
You can't. You know, and I would say, you know, from 2016 to 2018, I felt like a punching bag because, like all journalists, you know, I certainly felt handcuffed because as I was getting attacked with these really noxious, dehumanizing statements, threats to murder, threats to rape, I mean, this is now normal. What world is that normal? Why has this been allowed to be normal? So you know, what we did as journalists is we analyzed the data. It's publicly available. We showed it. We exposed the propaganda machine, weaponizing the internet, and showed you how, you know, these kinds of exponential attacks bottom up are echoed top down and then followed by the weaponization of the law. Look, this is my 35th year as a journalist, and in less than 2 years, I received the Philippine government filed 10 arrest warrants against me. I mean, I would never have thought that this is possible, especially since I committed no crime except to be a journalist.
Yeah, so then the big question becomes that, you know, within a democracy, while there is ostensibly there is rule of law, the species called the journalist who's questioning the authority is really marginalized. So many of our journalists, I mean, I can think of Hamid Mir, I can think of Talat Hussain, I can think of, I mean, others are still in there but battling it away, people like Asma Shirazi and many more, Matiullah Jan, etc., people you wouldn't know but who've actually struggled to say what the facts are, but it becomes almost very difficult to sustain. I mean, these people sustain. I'll come to how Pakistani journalists have fought back and still retain the space to perform their tasks. But in terms of democratic dictatorships, the strongman phenomena, we look at India, Philippines, we look at some in South America, we look at Putin. Where Putin is a bad example, but I think Modi got elected by genuine votes, but those genuine votes are creating an India where you see what's happening there. So how do journalists not get intimidated, continue to battle on? It becomes almost difficult.
It is the most dangerous time to be a journalist, I think, all around the world, all of the countries that you mentioned, and yet it is the time when journalism is most needed by a democracy. And to the Pakistani journalists, I hope you realize this award is for you. I feel like I'm only a placeholder because it has just become so incredibly difficult to do our jobs, right? And so I think about this in three ways, because we have to stay optimistic, right? So how do I stay optimistic? I look at it in three ways. This is the way Rappler deals with it. We look at the technology, journalism, and community. In terms of technology, we are demanding, I continue to demand that guardrails, legislation be put in place around these social media platforms. We shouldn't be insidiously manipulated, because that kind of manipulation essentially cripples free will, which is necessary for a democracy. This kind of data, a business model Shoshana Zuboff called surveillance capitalism, essentially allows the model of yourself, right, put together by machine intelligence, by machine learning, that knows you better than you know yourself and can be sold to the highest bidder. So you can be manipulated by a company or a country. That the new propaganda and the new advertising. So I think that's the first, is that there have to be guardrails in place, legislation, and the world is moving there, although it's not going to be fast enough for our presidential elections in May. The second is we need to help independent journalism survive. That is critical for me, and that's part of the reason. Before the announcement of the prize, I had agreed to co-chair the International Fund for Public Interest Media. My co-chair is the former New York Times CEO, and what we're going to try to do is to increase overseas development assistance from 0.3% to 1%. And that little increase, new money to help independent journalism survive, can then be used by independent news groups in countries like yours and mine to kind of plug the hole of this time period before, as guardrails are being put in place around the tech. And then finally, the last part is we have to address our community. A lot of news heads ask me, so how do we restore trust? And it is tough because news organizations are no longer the gatekeepers. We lost that power around 2014, and you can see this in the dual realities of the Ukraine, right? But community is the most critical part. And I think the way we maintain that is we build communities of action. Democracy has become a man-to-man, woman-to-woman defense because of the atomization on social media. So, we need to, I always say that Rappler builds communities of action, and the food we feed our communities is journalism. Civic action is necessary. You have to ask yourself, if you're in a democracy trying to help it survive, what are you willing to sacrifice for the truth?
नाज़रीन, इस पॉइंट पे हम ब्रेक लेते हैं, ब्रेक के बाद वापस आते हैं. स्टे विद अस. हमारे साथ मारिया रेसा हैं, नोबेल लॉरिएट. उनसे गुफ्तगू जारी रखते हैं. when you talk of free will, and the problem of majoritarian dictatorship is that the free will of the majority can want basically virtually homicide against a minority, which is what we are seeing in our region. So then the journalist has an additional task. In addition to calling authority to accountability, there is something more that the journalist has to do today.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I go back to our information ecosystem, because the algorithmic amplification amplifies, actually prioritizes the worst of human nature. It feeds the worst of human nature. What spreads fastest in these algorithms that are distributing news to our people in your country and in mine? What spreads fastest are lies laced with anger and hate. It's a half-truth or a half-lie, but hate, conspiracy theories, this is the toxic sludge that gets greater amplification. And yes, what it does is it encourages, especially if you have a leader like mine, which, President Duterte is sexist at best, he's misogynist at worst, and he uses, like former President Trump, an us against them kind of style of leadership, right? And it uses violence. So when you do that, you encourage violence in the real world. You encourage the worst of human nature. And I think that one of the things we have to do is to deal with this kind of emergent behavior that is happening globally. And that's part of the reason I go back to the analogy to World War II, that we have to think like an atom bomb exploded in our information ecosystem, and we must come together. It should be multilateral, multi-stakeholder to find a solution. I know you talked about just journalists, right? But this isn't just a journalist's problem. Our lives have just gotten harder, but it is every democracy's problem right now.
So absolutely, it's every democracy's problem, and as you just said, that it's beyond just the journalists. But if we were to just come back to the journalists, we are also dealing, Maria, with the problem of rising expectations on the one hand, where we see that the democratic system, while the path is correct, it seems inadequate, and so it seems like there's a role for the journalists, which is in addition to saying we want democracy. I think that we have to now be talking about something more, maybe be in the vanguard of social reform in human civilization.
I think that's kind of falling on our laps, right? It's the way you said it. So the chair of the Nobel Committee, Berit Reiss-Andersen, actually said that, the path to peace, she said that democracy is essential to peace, and facts are essential to a democracy, right? You can't get people together if you can't agree on the facts. And the way the algorithmic design works is that it tears apart that shared reality.
Yeah.
You must have that shared reality. So, yeah, I guess, in that sense, I feel like what we're doing in the Philippines is kind of trying to hold together this widening gap between the rich and the poor. This is happening everywhere around the world, especially with COVID. All of the legislation has protected the wealthy, and the poor have little safety net. In my country, that legislation was never passed. So I think this, yes, I agree with you, but it goes back down to the protection of facts. And that's part of the reason, I keep saying that when it's a battle for facts, journalism is activism. But I think the other part that we need are visionary leaders who know how to fight this violence and hate that is amplified by digital authoritarians or digital populists, right? This us against them. I think we need a vision of leadership. This is this moment in time, right? Especially after we come out of the lockdown of the pandemic, as the world returns to, it's never going to be the way it used to be, but when we come out of our homes, we're going to be stepping on the rubble of the world that was. And this gives us the opportunity to rethink, reimagine a much better world that is more sustainable, more equal, and more caring, empathetic. I think that's the part that we're losing. We're losing the resilience, the empathy, the goodness of human nature in these. Marshall McLuhan said it, right? The medium is the message. And right now, that medium where our news travels must change its amplification rules.
I think I couldn't agree more with you that, the goodness of humanity seems to be dissipating, disappearing. And connected to that is, the emergence of myriads of contested realities. So, how do we as journalists, let's take the national context, right? How do we in national context create a shared reality when the contested realities, there are just, things are breaking down, as you just mentioned, atomization. What do journalists do in that situation? What do you do in that situation?
We expose the way the technology is insidiously manipulating us. Because, we did these stories in 2016 that got us attacked by the government because we exposed the propaganda machine. We gave our people the data. You can't argue against the data, right? It's a 3-part series called The Weaponization of the Internet. I wrote 2 of the 3 parts, and the second part is how Facebook algorithms impact democracy. We could see where this was leading. So the first is tell people they're being manipulated. Having said that, their cognitive bias is still going to have them hunkering down. So you go back to, for us, we're building our own tech platform. We're rolling it out the beginning of November because we have elections in May 2022. And we want to have fact-based, evidence-based discussions. And it is almost impossible to have that on social media today. And then the third part is we're literally building communities of action, because the biggest problem the world has today is that these lies travel at viral, exponential speed, right? And yet civil society, democracy is a thinking slow process. So here comes all the lies, but then the NGOs, civil society, journalists, we still move at a very slow glacial pace. So somehow we need to bring this together, right? So what we're trying to do is to literally build these communities of action in the virtual world so that we shorten the time from when the news comes to when an NGO acts on it. We must, I don't know whether we're doing the right thing. I guess that's the hard part, right? We just have to keep pushing forward, but the biggest game changer is technology, and so this is why I appeal for enlightened self-interest from these tech platforms, these American companies that have made tremendous amounts of money, but have not done enough for the safety of the users on their platforms.
Nazin, we'll take a break at this point. Wapas aate hain, stay with us. Welcome back, Nazin. हम बात कर रहे हैं फिलीपींस की जर्नलिस्ट जो कि नोबेल लॉरिएट हैं. Just in terms of us, the journalist community, we seem to be very engaged with geopolitics and power play because, that's context setting, it's important, and yet you think that we are focusing enough for the well-being of the common person, for the average person. Are we doing enough, or do you see that in this world of contestations and chaos, we seem to have moved more towards journalism related to power play and geopolitics?
I think what we're seeing from the data is that geopolitical power play is part of what is attacking us, right? And you see this in every country around the world. The truth teller, the journalist, gets attacked, and they, like this is what happened to me. You get pounded to silence because you don't know what's happening, and then the second impact of that attack is that your credibility is tarnished, right? There's a manufactured astroturfing that people tend to believe, right? So they're connected, but I think that one of the things we can do is to realize that the old world of competition against news groups is gone, right? This is something I try to say among Filipino news organizations, that we are all on the same side. Facts. It is the battle for facts, and that we must, if we want to use these social platforms, we must share each other. We need to work together. This is something that used to happen at a slower pace when I was a much younger reporter. But I think that building on these stories, when someone breaks an exclusive, that another news organization takes it, and that building, that's almost getting curtailed because the pace of the news is too fast. So, we need to, I think journalists need to understand the tech. We need to build the tech, because tech built by journalists will have have that mission, have the public service built in.
Yeah, so very quickly, what you just said, that, we have to be in it together, and, the battle and the competition amongst news groups and media groups is much less. It's kind of a greater contest that we are in it. And I mean, I can just share this very briefly about Pakistan. Every government in power, every government, whether military or civilian, obviously varying degrees, have tried to squeeze the journalists, squeeze their space, and yet, Maria, what has kept the space intact is that we've been united and we've fought back together. And it seems that it's important that mainstream journalists stand there together and fight back. I think there is no power on earth that can actually push back journalists if they stand united. And I can tell you of Pakistan's experience, our struggle continues because the proclivity to suppress continues, but we fight back. So I think that's one important thing. Two people like you take the issue of technology and how sinister, and I hate to use the word, but I feel, so I will use it, almost diabolical in terms of its impact on the human race. When can we initiate things at the global level on that? When can we initiate, like the climate change? It's destroying the human race the way technology is. Yeah. So what do you plan to do on that?
I'm really sorry I have to go, but I'll answer that by just saying that is what I've spent the last 2 years doing. At the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, speaking in front of the foreign ministers who were there, we actually put forward this idea with the Forum on Information and Democracy that we need to have an observatory very similar to what was done for climate change. But look, I've always said that if we agree that an atom bomb exploded in our information ecosystem, that we need to do what happened after World War II, which is that was when the UN was created. That was when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was created, right? This is one of those moments. And that is what the Nobel Prize has actually shown. We need to come together globally.
I should let you go. You've been so kind, and congratulations once again from our entire group and all the Pakistani journalists. Thank you so much. Take care. God bless you. तो नाजरीन, आपने सुना ये मारिया रेसा का इंटरव्यू. ये नोबेल लॉरिएट थी. इन्होंने जो बात की कि सहाफ़त को जो चैलेंजेस हैं वो बहुत से वही चैलेंजेस हैं जो कि दुनिया में हर मुल्क को हैं, और पाकिस्तान को भी वही चैलेंजेस हैं, और पाकिस्तान के जर्नलिस्ट को. और ये जैसे वो कह रही थी, ये खाली सहाफ़त का चैलेंज नहीं है. हम तो ये कहेंगे कि ये इस वक्त बनी नौ इंसान का चैलेंज है, ये ह्यूमन रेस का चैलेंज है. और इस पर उन्होंने बड़ी दिलचस्प बातें की, और ख़ासतौर पे टेक्नोलॉजी के हवाले से भी. तो आज हमारी तरफ से इतना ही. खुदा हाफिज़. पाकिस्तान जिंदाबाद.